4:12 in the morning. Boston was still buried in the blue-gray shadow of a January winter. Old ash-colored snow had piled into dirty slush along the edges of the back parking lot, where ambulances rolled in and out all night without pause. The harbor wind whistled through the long glass corridors of St. Aurelius Children's Hospital, making a low, wheezing sound, like someone gasping for breath through a bruised chest. Rachel Carter was on her knees on the floor of VIP Room 7B in the Pediatric Executive Suite, a luxury wing for New England's wealthiest families. Her knees pressed against the cold tile, aching right through the cheap protective pads whose rubber had worn away years ago. The smell of bleach and peroxide had clung to her hands for so many years that sometimes, even after she went home and showered, she could still feel it buried deep in her skin. A thin streak of blood trailed from the edge of the hospital bed to the base of the Italian leather sofa near the window. Rachel wiped it again, slowly, thoroughly. Leaving nothing behind, it was her habit, doing everything as if someone were going to inspect every detail, even though almost no one in this hospital even knew her name. The bedside monitor beeped in a steady, rhythmic pulse. Outside the window, Boston was still hours away from waking. The distant skyscrapers of the financial district loomed like ghosts behind a thin veil of snow. A medical helicopter sliced across the dark sky, then vanished over the far side of the harbor. The phone in her pocket buzzed. Rachel paused for a second, then pulled it out. A text message from St. Matthew's Elementary appeared on the lock screen. "Mom, are you coming home for breakfast today?" Rachel stared at the words longer than she should have. Her fingers were cracked and raw from the winter disinfectants. A tiny split at the tip of her index finger, which had started bleeding again while she was changing the sheets for a pediatric patient in the next room, throbbed. She gently tapped the screen, opening her banking app in a near-subconscious reflex. $41.82. That was all she had left, with rent due on Monday. Rachel locked the screen. She took a slow, deep breath. Then she went back to wiping away the remaining trace of blood at the foot of the sofa. She was 36 years old, a single mother. She had been working as a night shift CNA at St. Aurelius for almost 6 years. 5 night shifts a week, sometimes 6 if the hospital was understaffed. After taxes and insurance, her paycheck was just enough to survive, but never enough to breathe. Boston was the kind of city that made you feel like you were always running late for your next bill. She used to study nursing at UMass Boston. She used to think she would become a pediatric ICU nurse. She used to have a small apartment, an old SUV, and a husband who drove long-haul trucks and sang out of tune in the kitchen at midnight. Then a hailstorm on Interstate 90 took it all away in just 7 minutes. After that came the hospital bills, the funeral, daycare, the night shifts, and a life where every day was chopped up into tiny increments, just enough to keep from falling apart. Rachel stood up, tossed the cleaning cloth into a red biohazard bag, and wheeled her cart out into the hallway. The fluorescent lights of the hospital hallway in the pre-dawn hours always had a pale, sterile glow that made everyone look years older than they actually were. A nurse rushed past her, eyes glued to a patient chart on her tablet, murmuring a quick thank you without even looking up. Rachel smiled out of habit. She was used to being part of the background. People like her always were in a hospital. The CNA's housekeeping, the orderlies, night transport, the invisible hands that kept the place running at 3 in the morning, but were never featured in the fundraising photos hanging in the main lobby. They cleaned up blood, changed soiled sheets, held sick patients as they threw up in the middle of the night, found lost teddy bears for crying children. They cleaned up the things that others preferred not to see. And then they vanished before dawn. Rachel was pushing her cart toward the end of the hallway when she heard the sharp click of leather shoes behind her. Not fast, not loud, but enough to make her shoulders tense up. Victor Calloway, the night shift operations manager at St. Aurelius. Victor was in his early 40s. His hair was slicked back so neatly that every strand looked like it had been measured with a ruler. His white shirt was perfectly pressed, devoid of a single crease. On his wrist was a navy blue-faced Omega watch, and a black clipboard was tucked tightly under his arm. He had started as an orderly himself more than 15 years ago. In a way, having once been poor had turned Victor into the kind of man who believed that all human suffering could be overcome with sheer discipline. He didn't believe in burnout. He didn't believe in coddling staff. He didn't believe emotions had any place in running a hospital. Victor believed in checklists, efficiency, and task completion times. He stopped right in front of Rachel and glanced at his watch. She was 11 minutes behind schedule in the pediatric East Wing. Rachel knew exactly what was coming. Last night, a little pediatric patient couldn't sleep after chemotherapy. A little girl about 6 years old cried for nearly 40 minutes because she was afraid of the dark. Rachel sat by her bedside and told her a story about a lighthouse off the coast of Maine until she finally fell asleep, just 11 minutes off her checklist. Victor flipped open his clipboard. "I've told you before, Rachel, your job is to complete patient support protocols, not to act as a midnight therapist." "She just finished chemo." Victor looked up at her for the first time. "And does that change any of our KPs?" Rachel stayed quiet. In the hallway behind them, there was only the distant rattle of a medicine cart and the faint hum of the heater vibrating inside the walls. Victor handed her an internal warning slip. "Sign here." Rachel looked down at the paper. "Employee time inefficiency report. A sleepless kid isn't in your job description, Rachel. If you want to keep your job here, I suggest you remember that." Rachel signed her name. She didn't argue. She had learned a long time ago that people living on hourly wages rarely have the luxury of defending their dignity in the pre-dawn hours. Victor clipped the paper back into his board and walked away. Rachel stood alone in the cold white hallway. Her phone buzzed again, a new voicemail from Lily. "Make sure to wear your scarf, Mom. It's really cold today." Rachel closed her eyes for a few seconds. Then she went back to pushing her cleaning cart down the seemingly endless corridor of the hospital wing, where families paid $12,000 a night for their children to sleep on Egyptian cotton sheets and look out over Boston Harbor. No one on this floor knew that once a month the woman scrubbing the floor at their feet sat in the basement blood, quietly donating the most precious thing her body had. AB negative. It was so rare that hospitals could only pray someone would show up in time. Rachel had been showing up for 2 years. No one knew. No one thanked her. Every time she finished donating, she would grab 2 complimentary packs of cookies from the blood bank, slipping them into her pocket to bring home for Lily's breakfast before school. Her mother had once told her something Rachel never forgot. Blood is the only thing the rich and the poor share equally. When you give your blood, you are giving life itself. 3 floors above where Rachel Carter was scrubbing blood off the cold tiles, in the early hours of the morning, another world existed. A world that didn't even seem to belong to the same building. The pediatric executive suite at St. Aurelius was built with a $180 million grant from Northeast private equity funds. The walls were paneled with imported Italian walnut. The artwork was curated by a Manhattan interior design firm that specialized in 5-star hotels. Every room had its own dedicated air filtration system, a personal espresso machine, and panoramic glass windows overlooking Boston Harbor. On clear days, parents could see yachts anchored in the harbor all the way from the 7th floor. Tonight, the sky was heavy with snow. Warm amber lights from the financial district reflected on the dark water below like streaks of molten metal. In VIP room 7A, Noah Calloway was sleeping. He was a 5-year-old boy, thinner than a healthy child ever should be. His skin looked pale beneath the moon-shaped nightlight by his bed. An eye transfusion line was hooked up to his tiny arm, carefully secured with light blue medical tape. The heart monitor beeped steadily, slow, stable, out of danger for now. Ethan Calloway sat beside his son's bed, 47 years old, founder and CEO of Luxora Health, a $5.8 billion healthcare AI conglomerate that specializes in predicting rare pediatric blood disorders. His company's technology is currently used in over 30 countries. Forbes once called Ethan the man who made detecting childhood cancer 6 months earlier a reality. His name has appeared on Bloomberg, CNBC, The Wall Street Journal, the Davos Forum, the TED Health Summit. But tonight, Ethan Calloway was simply a father who had stayed awake for 3 consecutive nights, listening to his son breathe. He stared at the blood bag hanging from the IV stand, a B negative, a dark red, almost black under the dim hospital lights, the fragile liquid keeping Noah's heart beating. Noah suffered from an extremely rare hematological disorder that caused his body to destroy its own red blood cells faster than it could regenerate them. These hemolytic crises could strike at any moment. Some months were stable. Others, his hemoglobin levels would plunge to dangerous lows in just a matter of hours. Without a timely transfusion, his internal organs would begin to fail. First his kidneys, then his heart, and then everything else. Ethan had poured nearly $90 million into funding genetic research for Noah's condition. He hired the finest hematologists from Boston to Zurich. He flew first class across oceans just to meet doctors who could offer even a single % of hope. Yet in the end, what saved his son's life every month was still just a single bag of rare blood, something no technology could ever manufacture. A harsh reality that made Ethan despise the feeling of helplessness within his own body. The door opened softly. Dr. Evelyn Brooks stepped in. She was in her early 60s. chief of pediatric hematology at St. Aurelius, one of the leading rare blood specialists on the East Coast. Her silver hair was cropped short and neat. Her eyes carried the deep weariness of a doctor who had watched too many families break down at a child's bedside. She checked the monitors and adjusted the transfusion rate. Noah would stabilize over the next few hours. Ethan looked at his son. For how long? Dr. Brooks fell silent for a few seconds before answering. I don't know. That was what Ethan hated most about medicine, the uncertainty. In his business world, everything was driven by data, charts, predictions, algorithms. But in this room, a 5-year-old child could still die, simply because a rare blood type vanished from the blood bank at the worst possible moment. Ethan stood up and walked toward the glass window. Boston Harbor down below was blanketed in snow, its lights shimmering and reflecting off the windscape. He used to think money bought control. Noah was the first thing in his life to prove the opposite. How is the AB-negative supply holding up? Dr. Brooks didn't answer right away. Not good. How many bags are left? 2. Ethan spun around. Just 2. The statewide reserve is critically low because of last week's storm. Regular donors haven't been able to make it in. We are reaching out to New York and Connecticut to secure more. Ethan pinched the bridge of his nose. 2 units of blood. His son was staying alive on something that had only 2 units left in the entire city. It felt like a nightmare designed to mock every single success he had ever achieved. Who is Noah's primary donor? Dr. Brooks looked up at him. You know I can't answer that. I don't need an address, I just need to know. Are they going to keep coming back? Donor information is strictly confidential under federal law. Ethan let out a quiet, bitter laugh. There was no humor in it. I built my entire company on global pediatric medical data, and I'm not allowed to know who is keeping my own son alive. It's not that you're not allowed, Dr. Brooks said softly. It's that you shouldn't be allowed to. Ethan stared at her. She continued. This system exists to protect donors from being pressured by people with more power than them. If we break that protection, donors disappear, and when they disappear, kids like Noah don't stand a chance. The room fell into silence. The air purifier hummed softly and steadily in the corner of the room. Noah rolled over in his sleep, hugging a gray stuffed bear tightly to his chest. Ethan watched the boy for a long moment. He had no idea that for the past 2 years, the person keeping Noah alive wasn't another tech billionaire, a global health foundation, or some high-profile donor who showed up at hospital fundraising galas. It was a single mother making $16 an hour, a woman who had been mopping blood off the floor of the hallway downstairs less than 30 minutes ago, a woman who ate free cookies from the blood bank for breakfast, just to save money for her daughter's asthma medication, 6:03 a.m. Rachel Carter stepped out of the east exit of St. Aurelius Children's Hospital before the sun was even up. The winter wind blowing off Boston Harbor whipped across the street like thin, icy blades. Old snow had been crushed by tires into a dirty gray slush along the curb. Ambulance lights reflected off the wet pavement, casting blurred streaks of red and blue through the early morning fog. Rachel pulled her worn gray coat tight around her, its cuffs frayed, and kept her head down as she hurried toward the bus stop. Her 12-hour shift had just ended, but her body still felt like it was moving under the cold white hospital lights. The beep of heart monitors, the squeak of rubber soles, the hum of oxygen machines, the muffled weeping of parents in the hallways at midnight. Those sounds don't leave a night shift worker as quickly as you would think. The number 15 bus was 7 minutes late because of last night's snowstorm. Rachel took a seat in the back row by the fogged-up window and pulled off her thin gloves, which had gone cold and damp long ago. Her hands were red from harsh disinfectants and the bitter Boston winter. A small crack on her thumb joint stung as she closed her fist. Her phone buzzed softly. An automated photo from her daughter's school popped up on the screen. Lily was standing in front of the classroom, an oversized blue yarn scarf wrapped almost all the way around her face. She was smiling so bright, even though her eyes still had dark circles from her asthma attack the night before. Rachel stared at the photo, a soft smile slipping onto her face. It was that tiny, quiet smile that exhausted mothers save for the only thing keeping them going. The bus jolted hard as it turned onto Dorchester Avenue. Boston in the early morning hours is a city of invisible workers, the janitors, the line cooks, night shift delivery drivers, snowplow drivers. The people heading home just as the rest of the city is starting to wake up with hot coffee and work emails. Rachel gets off the bus in front of an old apartment building from the 1970s. Sandwiched between a laundromat and a pizza place that shut down during the pandemic. The first-floor hallway smells heavily of old radiator heat and grease from someone's 5 a.m. cooking. Her apartment is on the 3rd floor, a small one-bedroom, low ceilings. a radiator that rattles every time the temperature drops too low. Rachel opens the door as quietly as she can. The apartment is pitch black except for the dim yellow light spilling from the kitchen. Lily is asleep on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket with a half-finished coloring book on her chest. The asthma nebulizer next to her pillow still glows with a faint green light. Rachel stands there, watching her daughter for a long, quiet moment. Sometimes she feels like her entire life is measured solely by moments like this. Lily is still breathing evenly. No asthma attacks in the middle of the night. Lily is still here. And that's enough. Rachel leans down to adjust her daughter's blanket, then walks into the kitchen and opens the fridge. Half a carton of milk. A carton of eggs with only 2 left. A jar of peanut butter that's nearly empty. An asthma inhaler sitting next to a cheap bottle of orange juice from the discount store. She pulls 2 free packs of cookies from her coat pocket, salvaged from the blood bank, and places them next to Lily's lunchbox. That's going to be breakfast today. Rachel changes her clothes and finally lies down at 6:41 a.m. She sets her alarm for 9:52, 3 hours and 11 minutes of sleep, no more than that. Lily needs someone to get her to school, before school care was already past due last month. Just as Rachel closes her eyes, her phone lights up again, past due notice. Little Harbor Daycare. Amount owed, $1,842.17. Rachel turns off the screen. The room falls back into silence save for the faint hum of the old radiator vibrating inside the walls. She drifts off almost instantly. 9:52. The alarm goes off. Rachel opens her eyes, caught in that familiar groggy haze of long-term night shift workers. Her body feels like concrete has been poured into her bones. Her shoulders ache. Her neck is stiff. Her eyes burn from chronic sleep deprivation. Outside the window, the snow is still falling softly. Lily is sitting on the living room floor, working on her 3rd-grade math with a tiny stub of a pencil. She looks up as her mother walks out. "Did you only get 3 hours of sleep, Mom?" Rachel offered a soft smile. "I got enough sleep." It was the lie she had told the most over the years. Rachel packed a simple lunch for Lily, then took her to school on the train because the transmission on her old Honda Civic had died last fall. As they walked, Lily clung tightly to her mother's arm to shield herself from the biting wind, the smell of snow, the aroma of coffee from a street cart, the screech of the train on the metal tracks. Boston in the winter always reminded Rachel of what it felt like to just survive another day. After dropping Lily off at her classroom, Rachel sat alone in the school hallway for a few minutes, pulling out her phone to check the bills, the asthma inhaler, the electric bill, rent, the medical debt from when her husband was hospitalized 5 years ago. It all added up to a feeling of drowning, very slowly. Rachel used to think her life would be different. 13 years ago, she was a junior nursing student at UMass Boston, a 3.8 GPA, doing her clinicals in the pediatric intensive care unit. Her professor once told her she had hands meant for caring for children. Back then, she had a cheap silver wedding ring, a small warmly lit apartment, and a husband named Daniel Carter, who always promised that one day they would buy a house near the ocean. Daniel drove long-haul trucks for a shipping company in Rhode Island. Then, on a freezing, sleety November night on Interstate 90, the truck in front of him lost control. The police said Daniel died almost instantly. Rachel got that call at 2:17 in the morning while studying for her pharmacology exam. After that, everything just turned into bills. The emergency room bills, the funeral expenses, the insurance lawyer fees, the daycare bills, and a 3-year-old who kept asking when Daddy was coming home. Rachel dropped out of school in the final semester of her junior year. At first, it was only supposed to be a temporary 1-year break. Then 1 year turned into 5. Eventually, she became a CNA because it was the fastest certification to start earning steady money. $16 an hour, night shifts, no guarantees for the future, but enough to make sure Lily had her inhaler whenever the weather turned cold. That afternoon, Rachel sat with Lily, helping her with her elementary school science homework at a small kitchen table where the white paint was peeling at the edges. Lily was coloring a diagram of the circulatory system with a red crayon. "Mom, yeah? Does blood really go all over our body?" Rachel looked at the scribbled heart on the page and nodded. "Yeah, blood carries oxygen all over our bodies. Without it, everything just stops working." Lily thinks for a few seconds. "So that's why you give blood, right?" Rachel freezes. "You know, I saw the blood bank sticker in your bag the other day." Rachel falls silent for a few seconds, then gently strokes her daughter's hair. "I'm just trying to help people." Lily nods as if it's the most natural thing in the world. "I like that." Rachel quickly turns her head away. Sometimes the kindness of a child hurts a grown-up more than any cruelty ever could. That night, as she's getting ready to head back to St. Aurelius for another shift, Rachel opens her cabinet, takes out her last ironed pill, and washes it down with tap water. She knows her body hasn't fully recovered from her last blood donation. She still gets dizzy every time she stands up too fast. The exhaustion still lingers. And there's still a cold chill deep in her bones. But next month, she knows she'll go right back to the blood bank, just like she has for the last 2 years. Because somewhere in this city, there is always someone waiting for a bag of AB-negative blood just to survive one more month. And Rachel Carter has never known how to turn her back on someone who needs her. Thursday, 1:43 in the afternoon. Boston is buried in another blizzard before the city can even clear away the ice from last week. From the 7th-floor window of St. Aurelius Children's Hospital, the ocean out in Boston Harbor has almost completely vanished behind a thick sheet of white swirling violently between the buildings. In VIP room 7A, Noah Calloway starts having trouble breathing. At first it's just minor signs. His lips are paler than usual, his fingertips are cold, his breathing is rapid. A nurse is the first to notice while changing his IV. By 2:06 in the afternoon, his heart monitor begins to beep continuously in warning. Dr. Evelyn Brooks is called to the unit immediately. When she steps into the room, Ethan Calloway is already standing by his son's bedside, his face pale with a look only a father who has watched his child slip away could have. Noah is shivering slightly under the hospital blankets. The little boy tries to open his eyes, but his pupils are already losing focus. Dr. Brooks reads the blood test results on her tablet and feels her stomach tighten. Hemoglobin 5.1, too low, too fast. This hemolytic crisis is far worse than any of the previous ones. Noah's body is destroying red blood cells faster than it can supply oxygen to his vital organs. If he doesn't get a blood transfusion in the next few hours, his kidneys will start to fail, and then his heart. Ethan looks at the doctor's face and knows instantly. He had lived with Noah's illness long enough to read a doctor's silence. Faster than any actual answer. How much time? Dr. Brooks did not beat around the bush. If his hemoglobin levels keep dropping at this rate, we only have about 6 hours before things get very dangerous. Then give him a transfusion. She did not answer right away. The room fell completely silent except for the steady rhythmic beep of the monitor, grating on his nerves like metal on metal. Ethan took a step closer. Dr. Brooks, give my son the blood. She looked at him for a long, heavy moment. Before saying the words Ethan Calloway dreaded most in the world. We do not have any AB negative left in the blood bank. Ethan froze. The air in the room felt like ice. He let out a soft, dry laugh. A short, strained sound of pure disbelief. What do you mean? You don't have any? Our entire hospital reserve was used up this morning for an emergency surgery at Cambridge Memorial. We have already called Massachusetts General, Brigham New York Presbyterian, Rhode Island Children's, the Connecticut Blood Network. She paused. No one has AB negative ready to ship. The blizzard has completely shut down the rare blood supply chain across the Northeast. Ethan stared at her as if she were speaking a foreign language. No, that is impossible. This is the top children's hospital in Boston. This is the hospital that New England's elite funds with hundreds of millions of dollars. This is where he himself had donated $40 million to the Pediatric AI Center. And now they were telling him that a 5-year-old boy might die, simply because they could not find a single bag of blood. He began to pace the room. Faster, more frantically. His entire body was as tense as a steel wire. I will pay for a private jet. Call Europe if you have to. Call Canada. I do not care how much it costs. Just find the blood for my son. Dr. Brooks stood perfectly still. Mr. Calloway, money is not the problem here. Do not say that to me. Ethan's voice finally cracked, raising for the first time. He rarely lost control in front of anyone, but right now, sheer terror was tearing away every last shred of his polite facade. I built an AI company that saves children's lives. I fund rare blood research nationwide. I pay more in taxes than the entire budget of some small towns in Massachusetts. And you are standing here telling me that no one can find a single bag of blood for my son? Dr. Brooks looked at him for a long, quiet moment. Then she spoke softly and slowly. Blood does not answer to power, Ethan. The room fell dead silent. Outside, snow lashed against the window like shreds of white paper flung by an invisible fury. She continued. Blood doesn't care how much money you have. It doesn't care how many times you've appeared in Forbes. It doesn't care how many billions Luxora Health is worth. All it cares about is whether there's a compatible donor willing to give, right when it's needed. Ethan whipped around. Then where is Noah's primary donor? We've had a donor for the last 2 years. Dr. Brooks tightened her grip on her tablet. Donor identity is strictly confidential. I'm not asking for their name to send them a Christmas card. I'm asking because my son is dying, and I am telling you, I cannot force someone to donate blood just because you have money." Ethan slammed his hand down on the bedside table. The water glass rattled. Noah stirred fitfully in his feverish sleep. That sudden outburst left the room dead quiet. Dr. Brooks looked down at the boy, then lowered her voice. "I know you're terrified. But if we turn the blood donation system into a place where the rich can buy access to other people's bodies, the whole system will collapse." Ethan turned away. He pressed both hands against the freezing glass. For the first time in years, Ethan Calloway felt completely powerless. Not the kind of helplessness of a dipping market. Not the frustration of an angry board of directors. But the most primal kind of human helplessness. His child was dying, and there was absolutely nothing he could do about it. 3 floors below VIP Room 7A, Rachel Carter was restocking medical gloves in a storage cabinet in the pediatric East Wing when she heard 2 nurses walking quickly down the hallway. Their voices were hushed but urgent. "Acute hemolytic crisis, AB negative. There isn't a single unit left in the entire state." Rachel froze. A box of surgical masks slipped from her hands and hit the floor. One of the nurses kept talking as she rounded the corner. "If we don't find blood by tonight, he's not going to make it." Rachel stood frozen in the middle of the cold, sterile hallway. The faint hum of the heater vibrated in the walls. A medicine cart rattled somewhere in the distance, and her own heart began to race. AB negative. Rachel knew that feeling all too well. That feeling when a room suddenly becomes too quiet. She had just donated blood 3 weeks ago, only 3 weeks. Her body hadn't even fully recovered yet. Still dizzy, still low on iron, still constantly exhausted. By law, she had to wait at least 8 weeks before donating again. Rachel knew that better than anyone, but somewhere in this hospital, a child was dying. Simply because no one else had what she carried inside her. She looked down at her watch. 2:21 in the afternoon. She still had nearly 5 hours left on her shift. Rachel bent down to pick up a box of masks, then placed it back on the shelf very slowly. Images flashed through her mind, Lily doing her homework at the kitchen table. Her daughter's asthma inhaler only half full. An account balance of $41.82. The wave of dizziness after her last donation. And then another thought took over. A 5-year-old child, fighting for breath on the 7th floor. Rachel closed her eyes for a few seconds. When she opened them again, she had made her choice. She pulled off her gloves, pushed her utility cart against the wall. Then she turned and walked quickly toward the elevator leading to the basement, where the blood bank's lights still flickered through the raging blizzard outside. Each of her footsteps echoed down the cold, sterile hallway, sounding like a clock ticking down the life of someone she had never even met, the saint. Aurelius' blood bank was buried deep in the west basement, tucked behind a narrow hallway that most pediatric parents would never see. No artwork on the walls, no windows looking out over Boston Harbor. Just the harsh buzz of fluorescent lights and the constant low hum of blood refrigerators running day and night. 2:37 in the afternoon. Rachel Carter pushed open the heavy metal door and stepped inside. The nurse on duty looked up from her computer screen, her brow immediately furrowing. "Rachel?" Rachel walked up to the counter. "I heard you guys need AB negative." The nurse stared at her, the silence stretching between them. "Rachel, you just donated 3 weeks ago. I know. The rules say you have to wait at least 8 weeks to let your iron levels recover. Your ferritin was already low last time." Rachel nodded slowly. "I know." The nurse let out a slow, heavy sigh. Out in the hallway, the winter wind rattled against the spewent windows, sounding like icy fingers clawing at the glass. Rachel placed both hands flat on the counter. "There's a kid up there who needs it, isn't there?" The nurse fell silent. It was that heavy, sterile hospital silence. The kind of silence people use when they don't want to say the worst out loud. Rachel knew exactly what it meant. "Please," her voice was even softer this time. "If I have what they need, just take it." The nurse looked at Rachel's pale, sleep-deprived face and shook her head. "You could pass out right there in the donor chair. Your blood pressure could plummet, and chronic iron deficiency can put a dangerous strain on your heart. You're working back-to-back night shifts, and you have a little girl to take care of." Rachel didn't answer right away. Instead, she opened her wallet and pulled out a worn, small photograph. It was Lily, smiling in front of her school's Christmas tree last year, a thick blue knit scarf nearly swallowing her tiny face. Rachel stared at it for a few quiet seconds before tucking it back inside. "If it were my little girl lying up there, I'd be praying for someone to do the same for her." The room fell completely still. Just then the door behind them swung open. Dr. Evelyn Brooks walked in. She had just come down from the 7th floor after a heated argument with Ethan Calloway. The moment she saw Rachel standing at the reception desk, she knew exactly what was happening. Rachel turned to face her. "I can donate." Dr. Brooks held her gaze for a long moment. She knew so many things Rachel didn't. She knew that Noah Calloway had been receiving blood from the exact same donor for nearly 2 years. She knew Rachel was that person. She knew the boy on the 7th floor was only alive today because of the sleep-deprived woman standing before her. And she knew Rachel had absolutely no idea whose life she was saving. Donor privacy laws existed for very real reasons. They protected people like Rachel from being hunted down by those with money and power. But right now, Evelyn Brooks hated the silence her profession forced her to keep. Rachel assumed she was weighing the medical protocols. In truth, she was struggling to lock the heaviest secret in the room behind her lips. "You just donated blood 3 weeks ago," Dr. Brooks said slowly. "I know the risks." Rachel answered instantly. "If you donate today, you might not have the strength to work for the next few days." Rachel smiled faintly. "I still have a shift to pull tonight anyway." Those words sent a dull ache straight to Dr. Brooks' chest. Some people in this world live as though they are never allowed to fall. Rachel Carter was exactly that kind of person. She stepped closer. "Rachel, if I let this happen, I need you to understand that you can stop at any time." Rachel nodded, but she had no intention of stopping. 12 minutes later, she was lying on a navy blue donor chair under the cold white lights of the hospital basement. The needle slid into a vein in her left arm. Blood began to flow, dark, warm, slowly traveling through the clear tubing into the bag as it gradually filled. Rachel closed her eyes. The first wave of dizziness hit her quickly. Faster than ever before, her body hadn't recovered from the last donation. The night shifts, the lack of sleep, the missed meals, the chronic iron deficiency. It all made her head feel light as if she were floating off the ground. Her fingers trembled slightly. The blood pressure monitor let out a quiet beep. The nurse looked at the screen and frowned. Her blood pressure was dropping. "I'm fine," Rachel said, though even she could hear how thin her voice sounded. "Doctor." Brooks stood at the foot of the donor chair. She stared at the filling blood bag and thought of Noah, 3 floors above. A 5-year-old boy was struggling to hold on to oxygen. She couldn't tell Rachel where this blood was going. She couldn't tell her that the boy she was about to save was the very same child on the 7th floor, with the moon nightlight and the gray teddy bear. She couldn't say that the boy's father was worth nearly $6 billion. Medicine sometimes forces you to stay silent, even when the truth is crushing your heart. 2:58 p.m. The blood bag was full. The moment Rachel sat up, the room tilted violently. She had to grip the side of the chair. Dr. Brooks immediately held her by the shoulders. "Don't stand up too fast." Rachel covered her eyes for a few seconds. A persistent ringing echoed in her ears. She felt a deep chill right down to her bones. The nurse brought her some orange juice and cookies. Rachel looked at the 2 packs of peanut butter cookies on the plastic tray and found herself thinking of Lily. She loved this flavor. Rachel opened a pack and ate slowly. It was the first thing she had eaten since 8 p.m. the previous night. The cookies were so dry they almost made her choke, but she realized she was far hungrier than she thought. A strange, aching sadness washed over Dr. Brooks as she watched this woman eat free cookies from the blood bank, while her very blood was being carried upstairs to save the life of a billionaire's son. Up on the 7th floor, Noah Calloway's transfusion started at 3:07 p.m. Dr. Brooks personally carried the blood bag up to the VIP suite. Ethan bolted to his feet the moment she walked in. He stared at the blood bag like he was looking at a miracle. He didn't even ask where it came from. There was no room left in his mind for curiosity. Only fear and hope. Dr. Brooks connected the IV line. The dark red blood flowed slowly through the tubing and into Noah's tiny arm. The first 10 minutes are always the most terrifying. Ethan sat on the very edge of the bed. His eyes were glued to the heart monitor. Then gradually, Noah's breathing began to slow down. The pale grayish tint on the boy's lips slowly faded. His fingertips began to lose their icy chill. The monitor stopped its constant, piercing alarms. Ethan bowed his head against his son's bedside. His shoulders shook. For the very first time since the crisis began, he wept. It wasn't a loud, sobbing cry, but the kind of cry from a man so used to controlling everything that when he finally breaks, he makes almost no sound at all. He pressed his forehead against Noah's tiny hand and closed his eyes. "Thank God, thank whoever is out there, thank you, to whatever stranger just saved my son." Ethan had no idea that just 3 floors below where he was weeping, the woman who saved Noah's life was sitting alone under the cold, harsh white lights of the blood bank, her hands shaking slightly from lack of iron. Rachel finished her last cookie and leaned her head back against the chair. She was utterly exhausted. Her body felt freezing cold. But somewhere in this hospital, a child had just been given a chance to survive the night, and for Rachel Carter sometimes, that was enough to keep going for one more day. 11:48 p.m. St. Aurelius Children's Hospital entered its quiet, strangest hour. The long hallways fell silent, the lights dimmed so the young patients could sleep, and the entire building began to hum with the soft, subtle noises that went unnoticed during the day. The faint hum of heaters inside the walls, the distant squeak of a medicine cart rolling around a far corner, a muffled cough from behind a closed door. Outside the 7th floor window, snow kept falling over Boston Harbor, vanishing into the deep dark blue of the winter night. Noah Calloway had finally fallen into a peaceful sleep after nearly 10 hours of fighting an acute hemolytic crisis. Color was slowly returning to his skin. His heart rate was stabilizing. His breathing was no longer shallow and labored. Ethan sat by his son's bedside in a rumpled shirt he'd been wearing for nearly 2 days. His tie had been cast aside hours ago. His Rolex lay face down on the nightstand, as if he couldn't bear to look at the time anymore. Dr. Evelyn Brooks had left the room just a few minutes ago. She assured him that Noah was finally out of the woods. For the first time in hours, Ethan could finally take a deep breath without feeling like his chest was being crushed. He stood up and stepped out into the hallway. A night shift nurse handed him a hot paper cup of coffee and went back to her work. Ethan held the cup, but he didn't drink. He just stood by the glass window at the end of the hall, watching the snow blanket the distant Boston rooftops. Exhaustion made everything in his head move in slow motion. And then he heard it. That name, Rachel. 2 nurses were whispering at the station just around the corner. She almost passed out at the blood bank today. I heard her ferritin levels are dangerously low. Didn't she just donate 3 weeks ago? Yeah. Dr. Brooks almost didn't clear her. Ethan stopped in his tracks. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but that name held him frozen in place. Rachel. One of the nurses shook her head as she checked medications on her tablet. I don't know how she's still standing. Single mom, pulling back-to-back night shifts, raising an asthmatic kid, and still donating blood like that. The other nurse lowered her voice even more. Do you know about Noah Calloway? The other nurse gave a faint nod. They both fell silent for a moment. That kind of quiet hospital workers use when they know they're standing too close to a truth that shouldn't be spoken aloud. Ethan felt his heart start to pound. Rachel. A name so ordinary he was certain he'd walked past her 100 times without ever noticing. He began to walk, not really knowing where he was going. Just following the instinct of a man who had just realized that behind his son's survival, there was a real, living, breathing human being. The elevator doors slid open on the pediatric East Wing at 12:14 a.m. This wing was a world away from the VIP floor upstairs. There were no art pieces on the walls. No Italian leather chairs, no scent of expensive perfume from wealthy parents, just harsh, sterile fluorescent lights, a humming vending machine. Cheap plastic chairs where exhausted parents slept hunched over. And the graveyard shift staff, keeping the hospital alive before the sun came up. Ethan rounded a corner and stopped dead in his tracks. Rachel Carter was kneeling on the floor. She wore navy blue scrubs faded at the cuffs. Her light brown hair tied low at the nape of her neck was messy from the long shift. One knee was pressed against the cold tile floor as she scrubbed a chemical spill near an IVR cart. Her hands were raw and red from harsh disinfectants. A tiny band-aid was wrapped around the knuckle of her index finger. Rachel didn't see Ethan. She just kept working with the quiet focus of someone who had long accepted that she existed outside the world's notice. Ethan stood there, motionless. A strange ache began to tighten in his chest. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to shame. He tried to remember if he had ever actually seen her before. And then he realized the most terrifying thing. He probably had. He had probably passed this woman hundreds of times over the last 2 years. In the elevators, down the hallways. On those long nights when Noah finally slept after a transfusion, but he had never actually seen her. To him, Rachel was just part of the hospital's background, a shadow in a uniform. An invisible night shift worker. Someone cleaning the floors there 1 minute and gone before dawn, even though she was the one keeping his son alive. That realization hit Ethan harder than any high-minded speech he had ever heard. A medical tech billionaire. A man who built his entire career on the slogan human-centered innovation. Yet he had failed to see the single most important person keeping his own son alive. Rachel stood up slowly. She obviously hadn't fully recovered from donating blood earlier that afternoon. She leaned lightly on her utility cart for a brief second to steady herself before pushing it down the hallway. Right then, a voice called out from behind her, "Rachel." Victor Holloway stepped out from around the corner of the nurse's station holding a clipboard. He glanced down at his watch. The East Wing is 17 minutes behind schedule tonight. Rachel took a quiet, sharp breath. Room 214. A pediatric patient was vomiting after chemo. I had to strip and change the entire bed. Victor jotted something down on his clipboard. That is not an excuse for your checklist to be late. Ethan stood at the far end of the hallway. He kept quiet. Victor continued. And I heard you went MIA for nearly 40 minutes this afternoon without clearing it with the shift supervisor. Rachel remained silent. She knew she couldn't say a word about what happened at the blood bank. Victor looked her up and down, shaking his head with a slight sigh. I don't understand why people in your position always think emotions trump protocol. This is a hospital, not a counseling center. Rachel tightened her grip on the handle of her cart. Victor made another mark on his clipboard. If you keep dragging down the wing's efficiency with these emotional distractions, you can kiss your night shift most goodbye next quarter. A heavy silence fell over the hallway. At the desk, a nurse kept her head down, pretending to study a patient's chart. Everyone was used to Victor Holloway, used to the way he spoke, as if human beings were nothing more than numbers waiting to be optimized. Rachel lowered her head ever so slightly. I understand. Her voice was so quiet, it was almost swallowed by the low hum of the wall heater, and at that exact moment, Ethan Calloway felt something inside him snap. It wasn't because Victor was cruel, it was because he realized he had helped create people like Victor. For years, Ethan had championed efficiency, optimization, cutting waste, data-driven management. His company, Luxora Health, sold that exact philosophy to hundreds of hospitals across America. Everything was measured in charts, response times, staff efficiency, minutes taken to complete a task. And somewhere along the way, that system had built a hospital where the woman who saved his son's life was scolded for taking a few minutes to comfort a crying child. Ethan looked at Rachel. She was still standing there, silent, exhausted, sleep-deprived, weak from blood loss, and still she kept working. A burning lump rose in Ethan's throat. For the first time in years, he felt utterly disgusted by the very world he had helped build. 5:58 in the morning. The Boston sky was still dark, but the snow had finally stopped after blanketing the city for nearly 2 straight days. Patches of old ice reflected the pale yellow lights of the staff parking lot behind St. Aurelius Children's Hospital 30. The wind, sweeping from the harbor through the narrow gaps between the high-rises, carried a bitter chill that made you feel like your bones were aching from the inside out. Rachel Carter walked out of the employee exit, an old canvas tote slung over her shoulder. Her night shift was finally over. Her entire body ached with that deep, familiar exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept in far too long. The faint lightheadedness from yesterday's blood donation hadn't quite worn off. Every time she moved too fast, the ground seemed to tilt for a few seconds. Rachel pulled her wool scarf tight and started walking toward the bus stop. Just then, a voice called out from behind her, "Rachel." She stopped and slowly turned around. Ethan Calloway was standing a few yards away under the harsh white light of the parking lot. There was no tailored suit, no tie, no trace of the powerhouse CEO who usually appeared on CNBC, just a man who had been awake for days on end. A black coat thrown hastily over his shoulders and bloodshot eyes. His face was so deeply exhausted it made him look years older. Rachel recognized him instantly. Almost everyone in Boston knew who Ethan Calloway was. Luxora Health, Forbes, the hospital fundraising galas, the keynote speeches on the future of healthcare AI. But she couldn't understand why a man like him was standing in the employee parking lot at nearly 6 in the morning. Ethan took a few steps closer, then stopped, as if he still wasn't sure how to begin. His breath formed thin white plumes in the freezing air. Noah's stable. Rachel paused for a moment. It took her a few seconds to register who that name belonged to. Then the image flashed in her mind almost instantly. The little boy on the 7th floor. The moon-shaped nightlight. The gray stuffed bear. The times she had changed his bedsheets in the middle of the night and told him stories about astronauts in outer space to help him fall asleep. Noah always loved those stories. Rachel remembered him asking her once if there was a hospital for kids on the moon, and she had answered, "If there is, it must have massive windows so the kids can see the stars." Rachel looked at Ethan. Noah was his son. Ethan nodded very slowly. He tried to speak, but his throat tightened. Over the last few hours, Ethan had thought about this moment 100 times. A gracious speech. A formal, proper thank you. Something worthy of the debt he owed. But standing in front of Rachel Carter, all his words felt small and embarrassing. He looked at her hands, reddened from harsh chemicals, chapped and cracked from the winter cold, hands that were still trembling slightly from blood loss. Those hands had kept his son alive for 2 years, while he hadn't even remembered her face. Ethan felt his chest ache in the strangest way. It was no longer the ache of fear, but the pain of finally recognizing a hard truth about himself. He used to think he understood this hospital, understood healthcare, understood people, but he had never looked down at the basement level, where people like Rachel quietly kept everything running. Ethan bowed his head, and before Rachel could even react, he dropped to his knees in the freezing dirty snow of the parking lot. Rachel startled, taking a half step back. What are you doing?" Ethan barely even heard her. He just kept his head bowed low. "I'm sorry." His voice cracked. "I'm so sorry. For not seeing you." A biting wind swept across the parking lot, gently catching the hem of Rachel's coat. Far behind them, a delivery truck backed into the hospital loading dock, its rhythmic beeping echoing through the dim morning air. Rachel stared down at the man kneeling before her. A billionaire worth nearly $6 billion. A man whose face graced the covers of major business magazines. Someone the entire hospital bowed to whenever he walked down the halls. Yet here he was, his voice trembling like a father who had only just woken from a nightmare. Ethan looked up. "I can buy you a house. I can pay off all your debt. A penthouse in Back Bay, college tuition for your daughter. Anything." Rachel shook her head without hesitation. "No," Ethan froze. Rachel tightened her grip on the strap of her canvas bag. "You don't owe me that, but you saved my son's life." Rachel looked down at the snow beneath her boots for a few silent seconds before speaking softly. "I didn't save him because you're a billionaire." The words were so simple, yet they struck Ethan like a physical blow to the chest. Rachel continued. "I did it because he's a child." The entire parking lot fell dead silent. The faint yellow light reflecting off the dirty snow made the entire scene feel like a weary pre-dawn dream. Ethan slowly pushed himself to his feet. He still didn't know what to do with his hands. Then, "Please, let me do something for you." For the first time, Rachel looked him dead in the eye, holding his gaze for a long moment. Then she said the words that Ethan Calloway would remember for the rest of his days. "If you're truly grateful to me." She paused for a brief second. "Change the way this hospital treats the people who are invisible." Ethan remained silent. Rachel continued. "The people who mop the floors at 3 in the morning. The CNAs who sleep for 3 hours, only to turn right back around for their next shift. People who have to choose between their child's medicine and paying rent." She looked him straight in the eyes. "Because we're the ones keeping this place running. And almost no one even notices." A cold wind swept through the empty space between them. Ethan felt every one of Rachel's words stripping away something he had tried to ignore for years. It wasn't just St. Aurelius, it was the entire system he had helped build. A system where the people who create the most value are often the ones who are seen the least. Rachel pulled her woolen scarf tighter around her neck and walked right past him. It wasn't dramatic, no sense of triumph, no bitterness. Just an exhausted woman who needed to get home before her daughter woke up for school. Ethan stood frozen in the snow-covered parking lot, watching Rachel Carter fade into the distance under the cold yellow light of the Boston dawn. And for the first time in years, he understood that there are people who change the world without ever standing on a stage to accept an award. 3 days after their meeting in the parking lot, Ethan Calloway returned to the Luxora Health headquarters in the financial district for the first time since Noah was admitted to the hospital. The 32-story glass building overlooking Boston Harbor was as bright as ever. Employees were still in meetings. Luxora stock was up 1.7% in morning trading. CNBC was still broadcasting an old interview of Ethan on the massive screen in the lobby. From the outside, everything looked completely normal, but Ethan knew that something deep inside him had changed. He stood in the private executive elevator, looking at his own reflection in the polished steel. Exhausted, older, and for the first time in years, no longer sure he was the good man he had always believed himself to be. The meeting began at 8:30 in the morning. The entire executive board of St. Aurelius was present, and the chief financial officer, the head of operations, human resources, the night shift manager, and the representative from the hospital board. Victor Holloway was there too, in a flawless white shirt, a navy tie. His clipboard sitting neatly next to his laptop, just like any other day. He had no idea what was about to happen. Ethan walked into the conference room without greeting anyone. He dropped a thick manila folder onto the glass table. "I want a full audit of St. Aurelius's entire night shift operations over the last 5 years." The entire room fell dead silent. Victor's brow furrowed slightly. Ethan continued. "Overtime pay, staffing cuts, the employee assistance budget, pediatric care reports, all of it." Victor was the first to speak. "Is there a problem?" Ethan stared at him for a long, silent moment. "That is exactly what I am trying to find out." Over the next 3 days, the entire operational system at St. Aurelius was practically turned upside down. Ethan hired an independent labor auditing firm from New York. In-house lawyers combed through the payroll records, hallway security footage was pulled, 5 years of timesheets were reopened. And the deeper they dug, the worse it got, so bad that even Ethan could not believe it. Victor Calloway had been secretly cutting CNA hours to lower quarterly expenses, forcing staff to stay after their shifts but altering time clock data to avoid paying overtime, pocketing a portion of the emergency fund meant for struggling employees, and worst of all, falsifying multiple staffing ratio reports to cover up severe understaffing during pediatric night shifts. One nurse broke down in tears during her interview, admitting she once had to care for 12 post-chemo pediatric patients at the same time during an understaffed shift. Another CNA confessed to sleeping in her car for 3 months because she could not afford rent, despite working full-time at the hospital. Every testimony felt like a knife cutting deeper into what Ethan had once called efficiency optimization. Victor tried to defend himself. He cited budgets, KPIs, financial targets, administrative protocols. But for the first time in his life, Ethan no longer saw those numbers as harmless. He looked at Victor during their final board meeting. "Do you know what the worst part of this is?" Victor still tried to keep his composure. "I did what was necessary to keep this hospital running efficiently." Ethan nodded very slowly. "That is exactly what makes you dangerous." Victor was suspended that very afternoon. 2 weeks later, he was officially fired from St. Aurelius. Over the next 3 months, the Massachusetts Attorney General's office launched an investigation into labor violations and medical record fraud under the hospital's old administration. Victor Calloway's healthcare administration license was revoked indefinitely. There was no scene of him being handcuffed in the hallway, no grand speeches, just a man leaving the hospital with a cardboard box of personal belongings under the melting February snow. And for the first time in years, no one was afraid of his clipboard anymore. But for Ethan, punishing Victor had never been the real goal. He remembered what Rachel told him in the parking lot every single day. Change the way this hospital treats the invisible people. So Ethan began doing what he had always believed was too costly to ever do. The Invisible Hands Initiative was announced in the early spring. Luxora Health committed $240 million to overhaul working conditions at its affiliated hospitals across the Northeast. For the first time in the history of St. Aurelius, CNAs, janitors, transport workers, and night shift staff all received a pay raise across the board, not some token bonus. It was a real raise, enough for many of them to finally be able to pay their rent on time, afford better insurance, and sleep without the constant fear of an overdrawn bank account at the end of the month. A free overnight daycare opened just east of the hospital, dedicated to single parents working the late shift. Rachel walked past it on opening day and stopped, staring for a long, quiet moment at the tiny cribs lined up by the sun-drenched windows. One CNA burst into tears on the very first day because, for the first time in 4 years, she didn't have to leave her child sleeping in the car while she worked the night shift. Ethan also established a new scholarship program, the Margaret Carter Medical Scholarship. Rachel froze when she saw that name flash on the screen during an internal meeting. Margaret was her mother's name, a woman who had worked as a waitress in a Quincy diner for 30 years, and who always said, "Kindness is the one thing poor people can always give away without having to ask anyone for permission." The scholarship fully funded the children of lower-wage healthcare workers who wanted to attend nursing or medical school. There were no fancy galas, no champagne parties, no slick promotional videos. Just a small plaque hanging in the lobby, for the invisible hands who keep people alive while no one is looking. At the same time, Luxora Health began building the country's first national database for rare blood types, a completely free system connecting donors, hospitals' blood banks, and interstate emergencies. Ethan personally insisted that no one ever be allowed to monetize donor data. He understood that better than anyone now, because some people save lives and it has absolutely nothing to do with money. And if the world begins to measure the value of kindness by financial power, then the most beautiful things left in this society will eventually disappear. 5 years later, Boston was slipping into early autumn, the maples starting to turn along Commonwealth Avenue. The morning air carried the smell of dry leaves and the sharp chill of the season's first breeze blowing in from the harbor. The city was as loud and busy as it always was. The same crowded subway trains at rush hour, the same packed coffee shops spilling over with finance folks, and the same lights from glass high-rises reflecting off the dark water of Boston Harbor every night. But some things had changed. So many things. 8:17 in the morning. The graduation hall at the Boston Children's Medical Fellowship was bright with soft yellow light. The long rows of seats were almost completely full. Families of the residents sat crowded together with flowers, cameras, and expressions of disbelief, as if they couldn't quite believe they had actually made it to this day. Rachel Carter stood backstage with the other doctors, wearing a dark blue graduation gown. She was 41. And today, after years of starting all over again, working night shifts, completing her fellowship, and practically living in the hospital with her head buried in textbooks, Rachel was officially a pediatric hematologist. Sometimes she still wasn't used to it. A young nurse walked past and called out, "Dr. Carter." Rachel still hesitated for a second every time she heard that name. She looked down at her hands. The rough, cracked skin from years of harsh chemicals had almost completely faded. Her fingernails were no longer red and raw from hospital-grade bleach. But she could still feel the chill of kneeling on the cold tile floor at 4 in the morning, as if it were yesterday. The announcer began reading off the names of the graduates. Applause rippled through the room in waves. Standing behind the stage curtain, Rachel scanned the rows of seats below. Lily was sitting in the third row, 13 years old, so much taller than before. Wearing round, black-framed glasses. That same old green knit scarf was too short for her now, she had grown so fast. Lily caught her eye and flashed a thumbs up, wearing a smile she couldn't hide, absolutely beaming with pride. Rachel felt a lump form in her throat. There were years when she honestly didn't think she would survive to see this day, that she couldn't start over and study again, that she'd never escape those endless, grueling nursing assistant shifts, that she wouldn't be able to afford Lily's asthma inhalers. But somehow, day by day, life kept moving forward. Slowly, painfully, but forward. The announcer called her name, Dr. Rachel Carter. Applause erupted throughout the hall. Rachel stepped onto the stage under the bright white lights, and then she saw Ethan Calloway. He was sitting in the very back row. No billion-dollar suits, no entourage, no press, just a middle-aged man whose hair had gone noticeably grayer over the last 5 years. Ethan stood up, clapping very slowly. His eyes welled up almost instantly. Rachel had never told anyone about what happened in the parking lot back then, except for Dr. Brooks. But from that day on, Ethan appeared at almost every major milestone in her life in the quietest way possible. An unsigned letter of recommendation for a scholarship. A quiet, anonymous donation to the pediatric hematology department, a weekend daycare program tailored for single healthcare workers, statewide support funds for CNAs across Massachusetts. He never tried to make himself the hero of her story. Perhaps because, for the first time in his life, Ethan understood that not everything needed to be seen to hold value. Rachel received her diploma. The sound of camera shutters filled the auditorium. The moment passed in a blur. But to Rachel it felt like watching her entire life flash before her eyes in just a few short seconds. The endless night shifts, the freezing Boston winter buses, the free cookies from the blood bank, the overdue rent, and an exhausted woman who once thought she was just trying to survive until the next week. The ceremony ended around noon. People stood up to take photos, hugging and crying. Rachel had just stepped off the stage when she heard a familiar voice behind her, "Dr. Carter." She turned around. Noah Calloway was standing there, 11 years old, healthy, much taller. His skin was rosy and healthy, a far cry from the pale boy who spent years in the 7th floor VIP room. No more IV lines, no more heart monitors, no more critical nights waiting for blood. The boy clutched a cardboard poster tube to his chest. Rachel let out a soft laugh. "Wow, you've grown so fast," Noah smiled. "My dad said you'd say that." Ethan stood a few paces behind his son. He didn't try to intrude on the conversation. Noah opened the tube and pulled out a slightly faded, carefully laminated sheet of paper. A child's crayon drawing, a woman in blue scrubs standing beneath a red moon. Beside it, written in a messy scribble, "Blood Lady." Rachel froze, staring at it for a long moment. She remembered this drawing. Noah had drawn it during one of his sleepless nights, handing it to her while she was changing the sheets in his VIP room. Back then, she just thought it was an ordinary childhood drawing. Noah clutched the drawing tightly. "I still have it." Rachel felt a sudden sting of tears in her eyes. Lily stepped up beside her mother and looked down at the drawing. "That's you, back when you worked at the hospital, isn't it, Mom?" Noah nodded eagerly. "Your mom saved my life." Lily looked up at Rachel. It was just a fleeting glance, but to Rachel it meant more than any award on the stage today. Pride. Not because of the money. Not because of her new title as a doctor, but because of the kind of person her mother chose to be when nobody was watching. As the hall slowly emptied, Rachel stood alone by the massive glass window, gazing down at the city of Boston below. The autumn sunlight glinted off the distant skyscrapers of the financial district. tiny ferries glided across the harbor waters. The faint hum of traffic drifted up from the streets below. Rachel looked down at her own hands. The hands that had scrubbed blood off hospital tile floors at 4 a.m, that had trembled from iron deficiency after donating blood, that had opened cheap cups of instant noodles for her daughter's dinner, that had signed disciplinary warnings just for spending time telling stories to a sleepless child. And now those very hands wore a doctor's badge. Rachel gently curled her fingers into a fist and offered a faint smile, because finally she understood something. The world doesn't fall apart for a lack of powerful people. It falls apart when the invisible people stop quietly saving one another. In the real world, maybe we'll never truly know who is quietly keeping our lives running. The custodian cleaning the hospital floors just before dawn, the driver navigating through a blinding blizzard, the night shift worker rushing home just in time to wake their child for school. They don't make the headlines, they don't stand on stages. No one applauds when they are running on empty. But sometimes, those invisible people are the sole reason someone out there gets to go home to their family. And maybe the kindest thing we can do in this life is learning to truly see one another before it's too late, or a more cinematic, gentler version to hold on to that final emotional note. If this story touched you, it's probably not because of the billions of dollars or the 5-star hospital. It's because at some point in our lives, every single one of us has felt completely invisible. And sometimes, to keep choosing kindness even when absolutely no one is watching, that is the rarest kind of strength in this world.